Honey, get the pitchforks, Jagex is doing something controversial again! So, in case you've missed it, Jagex has recently announced an update to their roadmap, which has gotten a lot of people very upset. The short of it is that they are planning on nerfing various drop tables for a lot of different bosses, mostly centered around the Elder God Wars and a little bit on the Wilderness Flash events and Raksha. This is mostly so that their drops become less important for introducing raw materials in the game and addressing a lot of gold being created that then fuels inflation, which then just messes up with the overall game economy a lot more. There's a lot of people that have their own ideas, and this is just my overall thoughts on what exactly they're doing. Is it good? Is it bad? And what I think that they could do for more long-term solutions. So, first off, is this update necessary? Short-term, yes. I do think that Jagex's, at least their stated reasoning for doing so, is important for the long-term stability of the game. However, I do disagree on the exact nature of how they're doing so. Nerfing a lot of different drop tables is never a good thing, and they've mentioned that in the blog itself. The problem that I'm really seeing is what exactly they're targeting. A lot of it is just with the Elder God War stuff, but you notice that there isn't really a whole lot when it comes to the Sanctum of Rebirth or the Gate of Elidinus. It's just Elder God Wars and a few other stuff that was introduced around the early 2020s. So part of it is just what exactly they're targeting. And overall, this is just for sake of trying to make skilling a lot more profitable. The problem, though, is simply removing one avenue of resources doesn't exactly solve the issue. It might impact one part of the problem for why skilling just really isn't all that profitable anymore, but you're going to need to have a multi-pronged approach if you want to actually get skilling to be more profitable than it currently is. Simply making things worse just to make something look a lot more appealing never feels good, and it makes players feel like there's an ulterior motive. In fact, I kind of have a little conspiracy that they're doing this just to make a mascot be more profitable when it gets released, so that way it encourages more people to do that when it gets released later this year. That's obviously more just a conspiracy theory more than anything. Zero evidence to back that up. But it does make you wonder, especially with how good Elder God Wars is. Now, again, do I think that these drop tables should be nerfed? Yes, but a lot of the problem is just how heavy-handed it is. 30 to 50% across multiple bosses, that's a lot. And I feel like what would have been better would have been to make these adjustments a lot sooner and a lot smaller. So, the analytical prospect of it, gathering data, it should not take 4 years to get data necessary to see the effects of this. Honestly, 3 to 6 months should have been what was happening. And granted, Jagex did make some adjustments not too long after the release for a lot of these bosses. I know Croesus got nerfed and not too long after it was released. But honestly, if they wanted to make sure that they kept an eye on these drop tables, they should have been continuously looking at these and making smaller adjustments throughout the first year or so of these bosses' release. So just making small tweaks, maybe a 10% change here or there in certain drops. That sort of thing I think would have gone over a lot better, and you wouldn't see such a drastic shift when it comes to what players are receiving from these bosses. And again, just keeping an eye on it and making these continual updates up until a little after a year on release, maybe a year and a half, I think that would go a lot better. Another problem that people criticize Jagex for, rightfully so, is that it takes far too long for them to nerf something. And I think that is a very valid criticism. It should not take this long to gather data in order to make wide sweeping changes. So that is something that I think Jagex could do a lot better job of in the future, is to keep an eye on what these drops are and update them within a timely fashion. That should be something that should be addressed. Now, when it comes to overall the goal of making skilling more profitable, nerfing bosses, making sure that they don't introduce a ton of other skilling materials, that's one aspect. But there's so many other ways that they can do to introduce new content to help facilitate this, or at the very least make sure that these sort of changes happen in a more positive light rather than simply nerfing current content. I kind of been thinking about what exactly Jagex could do that would help out in this sort of thing, and I kind of came up with 4 different things that they could do to make skilling more profitable. Again, I think a multi-pronged approach is going to be the best way to accomplish this, rather than trying to do a one solution fits all approach. So what I think that Jagex could do, maybe over the course of the next year, if they really want to try to make skilling more profitable, would be first, introduce more bad luck mitigation to bosses. I think one of the big reasons that so many of these common loot just get piled into the economy is simply people trying to log various bosses. And you're going to introduce a lot more common loot when you go 2 times over drop rate, 3 times over drop rate, 4 times over drop rate. Simply not getting the item that you need to finish a log means that every time you kill the boss, you're just getting more and more and more common loot. So having that bad luck mitigation, at the very least, to the point where you can complete a full log in somewhat of a reasonable time frame, I think that would do a lot of good to then facilitate players that would then move on to a different boss. You can get rid of a lot of common loot introduction just by making the rares a bit more common. And you don't even necessarily need to adjust the drop rate of these rares. Just introduce more bad luck mitigation to help with completing collection logs. If you do that, then people won't, at least some people, won't spend as much time on these bosses and thus introduce more and more of these drops and money into the game. So that, I think, would be one way of being able to improve a boss while addressing this concern. The second thing would be to have more gold sinks into the game. Now, a little bit of a shameless plug here, I have discussed 2 different ways of doing so, one of which was to find different uses of salvage, so that way it has a use beyond just making money. The other was just simply finding more avenues to dump gold off and be able to spend that in other ways, and removing that from the game economy. So if you want to see some of my solutions for this, there's the salvage shop and managing Menaphos. Links will be just in the cards that you just see at the top, as well as at the end of this video. But being able to address more of alkables would be a much better way of addressing this sort of inflation in the game economy. You need to be able to address this in some way, and introducing more content to be able to remove that money, I think, is a much better approach. There are other ways of doing this. My 2 ideas are far from the only ways that this can happen, but these are just ideas that I have introduced in the past that could potentially help with this, especially if the idea is just to being able to remove that gold from alkables. The third aspect that I think Jagex could do would be to just introduce more item sinks. Player-owned farms was a great way of introducing item sinks. You had various different seeds that you could get rid of, introducing more of a demand for other things like mushrooms or raw meat. There's a lot of different ways that Jagex could introduce more item sinks. Invention was a great way of being able to do this. I don't think we necessarily need a full other skill, though admittedly having another elite skill for money was an idea that I've had in the past. But even still, being able to introduce more item sinks like player-owned farms, like some of the Menaphos quests, the city quests specifically, just finding more ways of having item sinks for some of these more common materials is also a way to address the profitability of these items, specifically when it comes to the skilling aspect. Obviously, when it comes to creating a bunch of items, if you just create a bunch of it and no one wants it, that crashes the prices. So what you need is to find some way of using these items to help facilitate either getting rid of them in the economy or providing some other benefit. A lot of good that Jagex has done is when it comes to high-level content, being able to use more high-level stuff that is then used for something else. Overloads are a pretty standard example for this. A lot of the different masterwork, or like say the pickaxe of Song and Earth, a lot of these sorts of things that rely on other materials in order to create, that all helps create item sinks. The main issue is that so many of these are generally reserved for endgame stuff. So for all of the more common stuff, the lower level stuff, those also need to have some sort of sink. Invention only goes so far, especially with high junk chance. So having some way of offloading a lot of these different items would inherently create more value for skilling because they then have another use and would help facilitate players doing these skilling options, especially if there is no equivalent when it comes to bossing, even if, in fact, especially if it's more for mid-tier items. So introducing more of those types of item sinks, introducing more ways of utilizing these materials, that I think can go a long way to addressing value for skilling items. And then finally, I think of the last thing is that a lot of people I've seen complain about, but I think they're just a little bit off, is microtransactions. I have a lot of thoughts when it comes to microtransactions and treasure hunter and that sort of thing. But in terms of this video, a lot of what I've seen on Reddit is that people think that, oh, you're introducing so much money through treasure hunter and it's devaluing the economy. And no, treasure hunter is still a problem. Microtransactions are still a problem. But direct gold infusion is not that problem. Treasure Hunter does not introduce a whole lot of money into the game economy. A lot of like the money bags or the 20 mil, 50 mil, or like the 1 billion coin prizes, hardly anyone ever gets those. They don't introduce that much money into the game economy. That's not what the issue is. The main issue, I think, when it comes to Treasure Hunter, though, is bypassing skilling. Having materials, more specifically, I'm talking about proteins and skilling dummies, those things are what kill a lot of demand for raw materials. Because why bother paying a large sum of money for this when you can just save up a lot of proteins or skilling dummies and wait for a double XP event? Then you can get a lot of experience without needing to worry about buying a bunch of materials. That all messes with the game economy. So I think one of the main issues would be to try to limit the amount of proteins and skilling dummies that get introduced. Ideally, I feel like Jagex should just retire these. They do so much more harm than good in terms of the overall game economy. That's not to say that I'm advocating for simply removing them. A lot of people would want that. I think that causes a lot more people to be upset. I mean, we've seen people be really upset when Jagex is forced to remove old coded items to make space. Items that have zero use. And people still get upset because they want them for like weird collection logs or just to have something unique or weird. So actually removing something that people are actively using, not a good thing. But I do think that simply like heavily limiting these sorts of things or just removing, adding more of them should be the way to go, or at least work towards, if you want to make skilling a lot more viable. That way people aren't going to be able to more easily bypass a lot of different levels, and so people are then forced to interact with the game's economy a lot more. So being able to remove the different sources of proteins, not just from Treasure Hunter, even the in-game versions of proteins, like from the Motherlode Maw, the daily challenges. I think you can buy proteins from the Traveling Merchant shop, and then there's also a bunch of the different holiday events, and obviously the different bundles as well. Those should not exist anymore. That messes with the game economy a lot. So I think trying to limit those, all sorts of proteins, both the regular and unstable, all types of skilling dummies, the combat, the skilling ones, we shouldn't have those be introduced. At the very least, stop introducing more ways to get these things and let players just use what they have, so then that way they're just gone. I think that would also help with the skilling aspect and make players be more engaged with these sorts of skilling options, which then they have to pay for, which then increases their valuability. So those are overall my thoughts on this recent blog that's come out. Let me know what exactly you guys think. Do you have any other ideas for different item sinks or gold sinks? What do you think about the nerfs, and are they necessary at all? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon. So until next time, everyone, take care.